The D-Day landings had been a success. The Allies had gained the foothold they needed in France. They now faced three major problems. Firstly, the German army was hugely experienced, had excellent equipment and knew the countryside intimately. Secondly, the Allies needed a port to supply and build up their armies. And thirdly, they needed to capture the key city of Caen. The battle for the beaches was over. The battle for Normandy had only just begun. Taking the historic city of Caen had been one of Monty's main objectives on D-Day, but the Allies had failed. Caen remained in German hands. Its importance lay in the fact that it controlled all the major roads in and out of Normandy. With the Germans dug in tight in Caen, the Allies looked for a back route into the city. The small town of Villers-Bocage, controlling the main road from the west into Caen, was an ideal target. Normandy, D-Day +7. British tanks and armoured vehicles thrust deep behind enemy lines in an attempt to secure the town. They were about to learn a bitter lesson. On the morning of 13th of June, forward units of the 22nd Armoured Brigade came up that road and pulled up here, at the bottom of the hill in Villers-Bocage. Now, Villers-Bocage runs up a hill. 20 miles in that direction is Caen. This town is the back door to Caen. When the British arrived, the place seemed deserted. There was no one around. So the commanding officer took A Squadron, tanks and other vehicles, up the hill to park up, have a look around. The tanks and armoured vehicles of B Squadron remained at the bottom of the hill. Amongst them was Harold Curry, the 19-year-old wireless operator of a Cromwell tank.
We came into Villers-Bocage, no sign of any Germans. People came out on the streets, they threw flowers on the tank, gave us cider, and I thought, this is marvellous.
As Harold Curry and B Squadron waited at the bottom of the hill, the tanks of A Squadron were parked up at the top. What they didn't know is they'd actually been spotted by elements of the SS Panzer Division in the area. Now, the Germans had concentrated their best armour, the dreaded Tiger tank, a generation ahead of any Allied equipment, concentrated it together and put it under their best man, Eastern Front tank ace, Michael Wittmann. Wittmann had made his name against the Red Army in Russia, where he's said to have notched up 100 tank kills. By the time he was posted to Normandy in spring 1944, he was 30 years old and a national hero. As his Tiger blasted its way down the high street, Wittmann left a trail of British destruction in his wake. At the bottom of the hill, B Squadron was reeling. They were taking terrible losses. Eventually, they pulled themselves together and started to return fire. Wittmann's Tiger took a hit from a Firefly, the only tank the Allies had capable of dealing with a Tiger. So, realising he was outnumbered and possibly outgunned, he turned tail and headed back up the high street, on his way collecting a couple of other Tigers to see what damage he could do at the top of the hill to A Squadron. Up here on the high ground, A Squadron was completely caught out. Wittmann had taken his Tigers across the fields over there and attacked from the side, just about here. He started dishing out the same sort of punishment he had down at the other end of town. 22nd Armoured Brigade was in serious trouble. Having knocked out A Squadron, Wittmann's Tigers turned back towards the centre of town. But this time, the tanks of B Squadron were waiting for him. The men at the bottom of the hill had gathered themselves together, gone round the edge of the town and formed up here in the town square for an ambush. There were more buildings here, there was more cover. They waited for Wittmann, he came down the hill, he passed that building there and they let go with everything they'd got. Eventually, his Tiger was knocked out with a shot from a 6-pounder anti-tank gun up the back of his tank, its only vulnerable spot. Although his tank was out of action, Wittmann managed to escape. Later that afternoon, German panzers returned in force to Villers-Bocage and British 22nd Armoured Brigade was forced to withdraw. The battle-hardened German army had slammed the back door to Caen shut, destroying about 50 British armoured vehicles in the process. But the Allies would be able to replace their lost equipment, thanks to an ingenious British invention. Down there is the tiny coastal town of Arromanches. as Normandy seaside resort. But in 1944, it was slap bang in the middle of the Allied invasion. From those cliffs, 25 miles in that direction, is the American sector. The British and Canadian sectors stretched 25 miles in that direction. But Arromanches itself was to be the scene of what has to be one of the greatest feats of engineering of all time. After D-Day, the Allies desperately needed a port, but Cherbourg and Le Havre were still in German hands. Arromanches would be the location for a remarkable British experiment, to build an entire artificial harbour. This is one of the few places in Normandy where you get a sense of the sheer scale of what happened here in 1944, mainly because bits of it here still for you to look at. On D-Day +1, the day after D-Day, from all over the UK, parts of a giant artificial harbour started to be shipped over towards Normandy. An artificial harbour, something no one's done before or since, built in total secrecy, so secret in fact that the men working on it didn't even know what it was. Millions of tons of steel and concrete, brought together to be assembled here in a sort of giant science fiction jigsaw, an artificial harbour, a port the size of Dover. What's visible here today are the remains of 73 prefabricated concrete blocks known as the Phoenix units. Up to 60 metres long and weighing up to 6,000 tonnes each, they were tugged over from England and flooded in situ. They formed what was codenamed Gooseberry, an outer breakwater to protect the harbour. Inside the breakwater were the docking points themselves, connected to the shore by floating pontoons known as whales. No one knew if it would work. Not only was it top secret, it was so enormous it had never been tested. In June 1944, George Batts was an 18-year-old sapper with the Royal Engineers, assigned to Mulberry Harbour. And what was your job actually on the Mulberry?
Our job actually was going out there, unloading the ships onto lorries. They'd come off, and I think I'm right in saying that the actual tonnage used to be up to 10,000 tonnes a day unloaded. I remember one time there was a problem up the front somewhere, and we had, my unit had a cable from Montgomery asking for extra effort for ammunition. And we increased the next day by nearly 5,000 tonnes.
But just as supplies were starting to build up, the whole experiment came very close to disaster. On the 19th of June, D-Day +13, Mulberry was hit by the biggest summer storm in living memory. The second Mulberry Harbour, in the American sector, was severely damaged, but at Arromanches repairs started almost immediately. It was back in operation within a week. The Allies now used Mulberry to build up thousands of tons of supplies for the big frontal assault on Caen. But they still hoped to seize a natural harbour as well. In the west of Normandy, the Americans were racing to take the deep water port of Cherbourg. But the countryside they had to fight through to get there was a defender's dream, the dreaded bocage hedgerows. Now, imagine you're an Allied patrol advancing up one of these lanes. Suddenly you come under fire. Now, you try to take cover, you lie down on the bank, but there is no cover. You try to get through the hedgerow, you can't. Now, this countryside was a nightmare for Allied soldiers to advance through. They grew to dread it. But for the Germans, it was ideal defensive territory, and they made the very most of it. They'd dig machine guns into the banks, they'd have self-propelled guns hiding around corners that would pop out, fire at you, and then disappear before you even knew what had happened. After 3 weeks of bitter fighting, losing virtually a man for every yard of ground gained, the Americans finally reached Cherbourg. But it was all for nothing. The Germans had completely destroyed the harbour facilities. So the artificial Mulberry Harbour became a lifeline to build up all the supplies needed for the final big assault on Caen.